Hello to Democracy Summer. Hello, all you wonderful fellows. Hello, supporters and patrons of Democracy Summer. Hello, Americans all across the country joining us for the first of our Democracy Summer seminar series, which for the very first time in 2020, we are opening up to all of America and the whole world because we've gone online. And so it's not just for these wonderful young people, high school and college students and young working people who've joined us. It's for everybody. They get the first dibs on questions of our magnificent political leaders and intellectuals and activists and organizers who are joining us this summer. But we very much welcome the participation of others as well. And we're starting a few minutes late. That's totally my fault because I'm just getting back from Capitol Hill, where I voted for DC statehood and I helped to manage the DC statehood bill. And I got to rebut a lot of the more absurd constitutional and legal and political arguments being made by the Republican Party, which to its shame voted en bloc, en masse against DC statehood. But we passed it in the House of Representatives for the first time in American history, voting to admit Washington, DC, Washington Douglas Commonwealth, named after Frederick Douglass, to admit it as the 51st state in the Union. And there is great celebration and jubilation going on in Washington, D.C. We know that there's a very tall hill for us to try to scale in Mitch McConnell's Senate, but this is a huge landmark achievement. The last time there was a vote in 1993 on D.C. statehood, it failed 2-1. And today it got every Democrat voting for it except for one, Colin Peterson from a very conservative district in Minnesota. But otherwise, it was unanimous among the Democrats. And so check out some of the footage and check out some of the argumentation. I think that the Republican arguments were very weak, but I know it's of interest to everybody who's tuned in about voting rights in America, and it is completely consistent with the theme of today's investigation. We are kicking off our 8th seminar series, which has the theme of 2020 vision. Is it time for a new reconstruction in America? But we're kicking off with voting rights, and what could be more central to American democracy than that? And we have two remarkable guests with us today. First, I'm going to introduce you to Greg Moore, who's perhaps the greatest voting rights activist, thinker, and strategist that I know. He was for a long time the executive director of the NAACP's National Voter Fund. He was the chief of staff for Congressman John Conyers from Michigan. He worked for the Rainbow Coalition, directing all of the voter engagement, registration, and mobilization efforts. And he continues to consult, caucus, write, and agitate on voting rights. So we're delighted to have you, Greg. And I also want to introduce you to the great Alexander Keyssar, who's a professor of history and public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He has written the magisterial, authoritative, and preeminent book on the history of voting rights in America called The Right to Vote, the Contested History of Democracy in the United States. It's a remarkable book that I recommend to all the Democracy Summer Fellows and to everybody else out there. And the prolific Professor Keyssar has another book coming out this month called Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College, which I read in one sitting through the night. It was gripping, and I think I've got a blurb on the back of Professor Keyssar's book because it's such a magnificent contribution, and we will get to that later in the summer Democracy Summer Fellows. But let's start off with Professor Keyssar to give us a historical overview. You know, I've asked him to kick us off with 12 minutes of reflections about where we've come from in terms of the right to vote, where we are today. And then we're going to kick it over to Greg Moore to talk about the voting rights struggles he's been involved in, both historically and then the ones today that we need everybody on the front lines about. And then we're going to open it up for your questions. Professor Keyssar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jamie, for the very generous introduction and for inviting me to participate in Democracy Summer, this great program which you have created. And thanks to the two fellows who are out there, whom I can't, and to everyone else who may be joining. Thank you for coming to this discussion. My mandate has been to cover 100 years of history in 12 minutes. and I will do my absolute best. Let me just try to hit a couple of the highlights, some of the major themes, crossing in little details. First, let's start with something with I think the original of voting rights in the United States, which is that there is no right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. If you thought that there was a right to vote, I'm sorry, but you do. The Constitution does not guarantee you a right to vote. That was a decision made by the framers of the Constitution in 1787. It had very little to do, or almost nothing to do, with principles or values. It had to do with the complicated politics of the ratification of the Constitution. They thought it would make it easier if there was no national suffrage requirement or no standard suffrage law. They left it and consequently they left it to the states. The federal government voting rights largely to the states, and that's where most of the action has been. Although there have been a series of constitutional amendments over the level of 100 years that have protected the right to vote, and in a little bit we'll put up a chart that will list those. So at the outset, at the beginning of our country, each state has its own set of requirements. And I think we can put up the first slide now as a backdrop. The normal, the most common sort of rule in a state was that you had to own property or pay taxes in order to vote. You had to be a white male property owner. And the most, my favorite quote, which is up there on the slide, is from Benjamin Franklin, and it was published in 1828, but he said this long before. But his dismissal of property requirements with what became known as the famous jackass story, saying, because if you farm animals counted as property, so if you had a jackass, you could meet the property requirement. And then, as Franklin tells the story, the following year, the jackass has died, and the man goes to vote, and he can't vote because he doesn't have the requisite property. So Franklin says at the end, "Inform me, in whom is the right of suffrage? Is it in the man or the jackass?" And at the outset, of course, the also interesting anomaly is that women in New Jersey could vote for a very short period of time, for about 15, 20 years. And in some northern states, African Americans could vote, although they lost that right in most northern states, every place outside of New England, by the 1830s. So we started out with a very constricted right to vote. It's broader than it is in countries of Europe at the time, but it is very constricted. Since that time, when we're talking now more than 200 years, I think one has to understand the basic shape of this history as having two very broad trends. One has been towards an expansion of the right to vote, the extension of suffrage rights to new groups, most often happening after decades of organizing. The right to vote doesn't just happen because people wake up it doesn't just enlarge because people wake up one day and say, "Oh, that would be the right thing to do." There's a history of struggle and struggle and struggle. Tax paying and property requirements are pretty much dropped by the end of the first half of the 19th century. And that happens at the state level, not at the federal level. Although to attach an important asterisk here, in fact, constitutionally, the Supreme Court decided that property requirements were inappropriate for to vote only in the 1960s. It was perfectly constitutional until then to impose them, but most states did get rid of them. And then the 15th Amendment, and here I think we can put up the second slide, which lists the different constitutional amendments. The 15th Amendment was passed in the late 1860s after the Civil War, and it prohibited the denial of the right to vote to people based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. As we'll see in a couple of seconds, the 15th Amendment didn't really hold, didn't really govern for a very long time. Then there's the 19th Amendment, which is listed there also, which eliminated sex as a barrier to voting. Madeline, if you could put up the third slide here too. This is a quote from the Standard Participants' History of Women's Suffrage, in which she, in one paragraph, narrates the amount of effort that it took to extend the franchise to women, sort of 52 years, so campaigns, 277 campaigns to get state party conventions. It went on and on and on. It starts in the 1850s and it finally succeeds only in 1920. And another constitutional amendment, which happened somewhat later in the late 1960s, is a constitutional amendment lowering the age of voting from 21 to 18. That really there are a number of factors contributing to that, but an important one had to do with the Vietnam War and resistance to the draft on the part of young people who were making the claim that it was wrong and perhaps unconstitutional, but at least wrong, to put young people between the ages of 18 and 21 in a situation where they could be drafted and forced into military service, but they had no right to vote. One other piece of legislation I want to mention is the Voting Rights Act in 1965. This is an extremely important piece of legislation that is designed to restore, and I'll get to that in a second, or to enforce the 15th Amendment. Actually, the subtitle of the Voting Rights Act is an act to enforce the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, because it wasn't operative in the South. The Voting Rights Act is passed as a way of getting the federal government to enforce the 15th Amendment and permit African Americans in southern states to vote. And then the Voting Rights Act is enlarged and expanded in a number of ways until it was effectively or partially gutted by the Supreme Court just a few years ago. So, but the broad history here is a history of expansion and enlargement. And here's the but, here's the second theme, which is very sobering. In just about all of these cases, the advances were followed by attempts to reverse the progress and to narrow the gains. The history of the right to vote is not a straight line history of progress. It's up and down, or perhaps the appropriate metaphor for the rhythm is that it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. You see this as early as the 19th century, when the elimination of property requirements is accompanied by the disenfranchisement of African Americans in some states, and by the imposition of, quotes, pauper requirements, saying that anybody who depends on public aid cannot vote. The 15th Amendment, coming in Reconstruction, is followed by draconian efforts in the South to circumvent the amendment with devices that some of you have probably heard of: literacy tests, poll taxes to keep African Americans from voting, understanding clauses where Black would-be voters had to demonstrate to white registrars that they understood obscure clauses of the state constitution. And then eventually the white primary in a number of southern states. By the time the Republican Party had been driven out of the South, the Democratic Party, the party labels and categories in politics are quite different from when they were today. But the Democratic Party controlled all of the South. And then the only elections that really mattered were the Democratic primaries. And in a number of states, they said, well, Democratic primary, it's just a private organization. We can limit membership as we wish, and thus we limit membership to white people. Importantly, while that was going on in the South, something similar was happening in the North to restrict the rights, particularly of immigrant workers and the poor people. The pressures leading to disenfranchisement were very much based on class. This is not just a matter of race. in the United States. Literacy tests were imposed in the North as well as the South. Very, very complicated and difficult registration amendments were passed. There were all sorts of of shenanigans going on. In some places, you had to register every year, and you had to provide a proof of residence. New York State, this is one of my favorite examples, as an attempt to keep progressive Jewish voters from the polls. The registration date in a couple of years, the date for registering to vote was on Kippur, the holiest holiday in the Jewish calendar, when Jews would not be allowed to go and register. And then moving more towards the present, the Voting Rights Act and other of the 1960s and other progressive steps that were made in the 1960s have followed over the past 40 or 50 years by a new surge of efforts to restrict the right to vote, to create. These take the form generally not of saying category X of people cannot vote. They're not in that form. The idea is to procedural obstacles that will prevent people from voting, make it more difficult to register. You can reduce the number of polling places, and probably the most well-known such devices in recent years are the voter ID laws that have been passed in a number of states, laws that require a recent or current government-issued voter ID of the sort that is readily available to anybody who has a passport or a driver's license. But there are a lot of, particularly among the poor, who have those documents at hand, and many states have made them increasingly difficult to acquire. Last thing I want to mention before summing up and handing this over is, and with the last slide, if we could put this up, is as we approach the November election, you should all keep in mind, even if you are 18, that in fact, you have no constitutional right to vote for president. That remains the case. Congressman Raskin and I have been involved in efforts in the past to try to remedy that, but we were not successful. And the Constitution specifies that electors, to go to the Electoral College, will be chosen in the manner that basically each state legislature shall choose. The legislature decides whether there will be an election to choose electors, and they can also reverse that decision. This worries me actually in the context of the current election. But summing up here, if the history of voting rights is a history of sort of a long arc is of progress, but it's always been a battle. And I think that what we are in the midst of in more recent years is the counterattack against the expansion of voting rights that occurred in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And also with the things like the passage of what's called the motor bill, the registration 1992, which made it easier for people to register. What we've been witnessing in recent decades is an attempt to undercut the breadth of the franchise by putting obstacles in people's path. And my own conclusion from this, and to those of you out there, is this means that we have to think of the right to vote not as something which is permanently achieved. Democracy isn't something we have, and we say, okay, check that box. The right to vote always has to be protected or nurtured. And I think that that's exactly the kind of thing that Greg has been doing, and will tell us more about what's going on in the trenches in recent years.
Professor Keyssar, thank you so much. That was splendid. And you mentioned the motor voter law, which Greg Moore was actually instrumentally involved just in getting done. He was really a pivotal force there. and has worked on all the voting rights struggles of our time. So, Greg, let's turn it over to you to offer your perspectives, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Well, again, thank you, Congressman Raskin. And just for those of you who don't know, I'm going to age you, Jamie. 30 years ago, we were working on D.C. statehood. And it was a fight to get the vote on the floor in 1993. And it was a struggle to get the Democrats to vote for it. And we didn't win that vote in the Democratic Congress and the Democratic Senate with the Democratic president. So I want to congratulate you, Jamie, for managing that, and for the Congress and the leadership of the Congress to get this passed on this historic day. Also, I want to thank Professor Keyssar for laying out the case that for many, many years has been a big hidden secret in our country, that our democracy was not made for everyone, that it took years and years of struggle. And so he could have went on for another hour, I'm sure, about the things that have been put into place, the roadblocks that have been put into place over the years. What's interesting about what he laid out was that I, as a young student activist coming up in the 1980s, can recall vividly how we encountered many of those barriers that have been erected. I worked on the Jesse Jackson, the Rainbow Coalition when Jesse Jackson was running for president, and we actually went throughout the South and we saw for ourselves the inaccessible registrars. We saw for ourselves the inability to get people to get even voter registration cards. You had to get 25 at a time. In Louisiana, the registrar had to be assigned to your event to have anybody register to vote. There are counties in some states like Georgia where you had a whole different set of requirements for voter registration than you did in another part of the state. There was no uniform system of voter registration in our country. And in 1989, after the two presidential campaigns of Reverend Jackson, I got involved with the NAACP and a number of other activists, the Leadership Conference and others, and we started working on, back then, the National Voter Registration Act of 1989. It was an attempt to use mechanisms of our government, like Department of Motor Vehicles and public agencies, to use those mechanisms to actually register people to vote. Now, at the time, voter registration rates were somewhere in the 60 percentile range, high 60s for the most part. But for low-income people, people of color, African Americans, Latino, it was under 50% in a lot of states. In some states in the South, it was in the 30 percentile rate, even after the Voting Rights Act passage. So what our attempt to do was to try and bring about a national uniform system. We started as a coalition. We started off with actually same-day voter registration, which is what we felt was the answer. We pushed that agenda item as part of the 84 and 88 campaigns. And in 1989, we began that effort in the legislature, in the Congress. Well, it actually took from 1989 to 1993 for that bill to get passed. We went through 5 filibusters. The 2 of them were in the Democratic Congress. We went through a veto by President Bush, the first, in 1992. In fact, he vetoed the bill on the 3rd of July before he left to go on his vacation for the 4th of July weekend, after we had worked for 4 or 5 years to get motor voter, as they call it, motor voter on the books. It was called an extreme bill at the time. Having people register to vote while they're getting their driver's license or applying for food stamps or applying for unemployment benefits was considered criminal. There are people in Pennsylvania and in Alabama right now who have criminal records because they were registering people to vote in line against local statutes. And so when that bill, we didn't get that bill to pass until 1993. And that was only because a Democratic president was elected for the first time since 1980. And so that allowed us to take that bill that we have been working on for 5 years. The other big thing that changed was that I became a member of the Capitol Hill staff. John Conyers hired me. And my first job on the Hill was to help get the motor voter bill passed. And so my job started on January 3rd, 1993. And thank God for those 4 or 5 years I had worked on that bill, because it was on the President Clinton's desk by May of 1993. that coalition work that we had done over the years had built the foundation for that work that we had done. And that wasn't the end of it. That was just the passage of the law. The law didn't take effect until 1995. And we spent 2 years in court battling states like Illinois, California, Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana. These were all states with Republican governors who were blocking the implementation of that law after it had become the law of the land. And so through litigation, through state legislative action that had to take place, we were able to get that piece of legislation activated in all 50 states, but only after many, many struggles. By 1995, we found out that all the arguments we had made about the importance of people being registered to vote came true. By the first just 6 months, over 15 million people have been registered to vote. And we did a study with the group Demos, and between 1993 and 2003, almost 50 million people have been registered to vote. And by the 20th anniversary of that bill in 2013, over 110 million people have been registered to vote through the provisions of the NVRA. So the great amount of work you've seen over the years by the civil rights community and the activist community to get people registered to vote, to knock down these barriers, came pretty much out of that effort to change the way we get people registered. So 100 million more people to vote. And by the time 95, 96, 97, 98, by the time 1999 and 2000 came, people were being registered to vote at numbers that people had not seen. And this, in fact, is what led to the debacle that we faced in Florida, because the turnout in Florida in 2000 was so great, that the lines were so great, that the machinery was not equipped to capture those many people trying to vote. And something as small as emptying out a chat box for punch card voting machines that were inadequate led to tens of thousands of votes not being counted. And so the big fight in Gore v. Bush was to say that we should count every vote. And that every vote was that there was a massive amount of people, not just in Florida, but around the country, who had turned out in that election. In fact, it was the election where, and we're getting back to what the professor was speaking about, for the first time since 1896, the person who won the popular vote, Al Gore, lost the election because of the Electoral College. So once again, that issue became front and center. So even though we had the NVRA, even though we had the popular vote won, we went through 8 years of a administration that was never popularly elected. Now, I'm from Ohio. I'm in Ohio, and I've done a lot of my work in Ohio, but I was in Ohio in 2004. And again, a repeat of what happened in Georgia last week and what happened in Florida happened in Ohio in 2004. Literally people in lines for hours and hours, and particularly young people on college campuses, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 9 hours. These were people who were standing in line because the machinery did not allow for a large turnout. And it was raining, it was pouring down, it was cold, it was November. People in line, the things that were done to reduce the number of polling places, to reduce the number of voting machines, to reduce the amount of people who could be actually vote or who could vote early. All those things led to a breakdown of the voting systems. And so it was out of that movement that the Help America Vote Act came about. In fact, after the Florida movement, to Help America Vote Act, which basically set national standards for counting votes, not registering voters, but counting votes. And so this counting of votes has become our new challenge. And the professor mentioned, obviously, the last blow to us was the 2013 Supreme Court decision to get rid of the Shelby v. Holder decision, which basically eviscerated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and it allowed states like Georgia and Mississippi and others to no longer have to submit their changes to the Justice Department. So when you ask what happened in Georgia last week, what happened was the Voting Rights Act was not fully enforced. The Supreme Court did not, the U.S. Congress did not take the steps to update and modernize the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Amendment Act has been on the floor of the Congress, Jamie, as you know, since 2014. We have not been able to get Congress to act on that. And so you will see more Georgias and more situations where there are inadequate provisions for people to actually be counted. So I know I'm running over time. Let me just mention one or two other things. The COVID-19 crisis has made this an even bigger imperative. We have people who are not yet prepared to go vote, and so we have to use mail-in registration as our new battle cry. We have to do that because people have to make decisions between living or threats to their life. They're in that vulnerable population. They may not vote. They may not think that's worth risking their lives. So the mail-in registration is essential to this. This is the year of the U.S. Census, so the census has to be done. Redistricting comes next year. And I guess the last point I would make is that we need a whole new generation of young people to serve as poll workers. One of the reasons we have these long lines is because a lot of the poll workers that we have are not showing up because they're in that vulnerable community. And so we really need hundreds and thousands of people over the next 2 cycles to register or become poll workers. And that's why we hope the young people will be there. But let me just say again, all these struggles from what the professor laid out to what I've been laying out have been long, drawn-out battles. I have the honor of serving as the House Administration's representative to the EAC, the Election Assistance Commission Advisory Board. I forgot to mention that to you, Jamie. Sorry about that. But this is a position where we've been able to advise the Election Assistance Commission to continue to provide funding to states. And that funding has come about, again, recently in just the last 1 or 2 years, which has allowed states to upgrade their voting systems and deal with some of the problems of cybersecurity. But I'll stop there. And again, just want to congratulate all the young people who are involved with this Democracy Summer Seminar. And thank you again, Congressman, for putting this front and center on your agenda.
Awesome. Awesome. You guys were magnificent. I hope that all the Democracy Summer Fellows and all of our friends will give a standing ovation at home to Greg Moore and to Professor Alex Keyssar for giving us really a remarkable and compressed history of the struggle for the right to vote, the continuing struggle for the right to vote, and why the young people in Democracy Summer are such essential players at every level. I mean, we are not remotely through the struggle over democracy. We've got the struggle over the Electoral College and the National Popular Vote campaign, which I introduced in Maryland as my very first bill, and Maryland passed it, and we now have 13 states trying to break away from this rickety and obsolete system to have a national popular vote by having an interstate compact in which all of the states agree to cast their electors for the winner in the national vote. We've got the problem of gerrymandering to deal with. We've got millions of left out citizens in Washington, D.C., in Puerto Rico, in American Samoa, Guam, Virgin Islands. We've got millions still of former prisoners who are disenfranchised in 7 or 8 states. And despite the fact that the vast majority of states have said, no, we're going to allow former prisoners to vote. And now we've got this whole new generation of problems, as Greg Moore tells us, with COVID-19. We saw what happened in Wisconsin, where the state Supreme Court overrode the governor who said, we're going to delay the election so we can institute vote by mail, voting from home. And the Republican-controlled Supreme Court said, no, you got to have it in 2 days. And so we saw, as Greg was telling us, hundreds of poll workers who didn't show up because they're in high-risk categories and they were afraid. So lots of precinct polling places that just lay fallow and nothing happened with them. And in some of the largest jurisdictions like Milwaukee and Madison, there were 2 or 3 huge precinct places for literally tens of thousands of people waiting hours and hours to go and vote. So with all of that, I want to ask this question, and then Paul, if you prepare to get the fellows' questions in. What do you think our Democracy Summer Fellows need to be working on this summer, understanding our major constraint is that we are not going out doing door-to-door, registering people to vote in person. We are on the phones, we are on the internet, What do you think are the critical voting rights efforts or struggles that we need to be involved in? And let's start with you, Professor Keyssar, and then we'll come back to you, Greg.
You know, I'm not sure I can prioritize the different activities that need to be done. There's an immense amount that needs to be done. And yes, it's, you know, doing it on the phone, but I think that this is a moment. I think one thing that has to be done is gathering the information and distributing the information to counter the Republican arguments, or some Republican arguments, that voting by mail is going to be subject to fraud and shouldn't be permitted. I mean, that's a current argument, and it's baseless. But you know, the Democracy Fellows, in doing whatever organizing, they should know that that's baseless, and they should have the facts at their command and be ready to do that. They should be, in whatever fashion they can, really encouraging their colleagues, other young people, to absolutely guarantee that they will vote. I mean, one of the disappointing things for me in the last 20 or 30 years is that there have been a lot of years when, before the election, it was said, aha, well, it looks like the youth vote will be up, and the young people are more engaged, and then it hasn't happened. Come the election 2016, the young people did not vote at very high numbers. It did change in 2018, and I found that very encouraging. And I think that this particular group of people can help that to remain changed in 2020.
Great. Greg, how about you?
Congressman, I think we temporarily lost Greg, but we're trying to get him back.
Let's go to some questions then. You have questions?
Right. So yes, the first question we have is from Richard Palma, who's a fellow.
Is it coming online?
He's coming online, yeah.
Great. Hello, Richard.
Let's see, just a moment. In the meantime, Claire Fan, could you ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I don't see an area where I can start my video.
Sorry about that. I'm working on that, but for now, could you just ask it?
Yeah, sure. So I know Asian American turnout rates are often very low. So I was wondering, going forward, how are we working to increase that? And is the Asian American vote becoming increasingly important?
Awesome. I don't know if Greg is back. I know Greg has worked in that field. If he's not back, let me just say, I'm hoping that over the course of the summer, we're going to have Dale Ho, who is really a leading voting rights specialist for the ACLU, come on and talk about the Asian American community and both efforts to suppress that vote by right-wing enemies, but also what's being done. So at least until Greg comes back, let's just reserve that, hang on to that question. Thank you, Claire, and go to the next one.
Okay, Sarush, could you ask your question?
Yeah, so if you look across the country, there, like, as you guys were talking about, there's like a lot of different voter suppression laws. And if you look back, like 1960s, the whole purpose of the Voting Rights Act was to combat like state voter suppression. So what federal action could be taken to counteract those voter suppression measures, like voter ID, and also mandate things like early voting and no excuse absentee options in every state? Would it be something like a Voting Rights Act 2.0, and what would be the biggest obstacles to making that happen?
Well, let me take the first shot at it. Thank you, Sarush. The Voting Rights Act 2.0 is exactly the right idea. We passed it as part of HR 1, which was the comprehensive democracy reform package that the Democrats started off with when this Congress, the 116th Congress, began. The major obstacle to it is summed up very easily: the Republican Party. They voted against it. We passed it. HR 1 passed the House, but McConnell said he's not taking it up. And it's got a full range of voting rights reforms in there, including universal mandatory voter registration, which of course is done in dozens of democratic countries. Instead of there being all these obstacles to registering people to vote, you're just automatically registered. It goes along with your social security card, or it goes along with just, turning 18. So there are a lot of things that we put in there. That is the main problem. It's kind of like the disease kills the cure. We've got a lot of good legislative solutions, but the continuing Republican control of the White House and the Senate makes it impossible for us to make any progress on it. And they've been blocking money that we want to send to the states for the purposes of having vote by mail in this election. So we asked for $4 billion in the CARES Act. They said zero, and we settled at $400 million, which was 10% of what we wanted, not nearly enough. And we're trying to get the rest in the HEROES Act, but of course they're dragging their feet on that. And there's not much time left for the states to get contracts for vote by mail if they haven't already done it. So Voting Rights Act 2.0 is going to be necessary. If we get the kind of landslide election we're fighting for in 2020, then we really should start with what Alex Keyssar is talking about, which is a constitutional amendment guaranteeing everybody the right to vote and to be represented at every level of government.
Can I come in on that also?
Please.
I think, another path to trying to protect the right to vote is, of course, through state legislation. But at this point, that requires, in effect, I hate to make it sound like a partisan battle, but it's electing more Democrats to state legislatures and electing more Democratic governors. A number of most of the voter suppressive efforts are coming from state governments. Now, the history also tells us that we can't rely on the states to solve the problems over the long run, because states have a long tradition of suppressing the particular people that they want to suppress, which varies by state. And that's why the Voting Rights Act 2.0 is absolutely essential. But there are paths, particularly in some states, which are becoming more purple, to doing effective things at the state level.
Great. Let's go to the next question.
Next up, we have Richard Palma.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Palma. Currently, I'm a Montgomery College student. My question pertains to voter suppression. And I also want to thank Professor Keyssar, and please send my regards to Mr. Moore when he gets back online. But my question pertains to voter suppression. Currently, my concern is, what's the most common form of voter suppression in the United States, and what can passionate youth organizers do to dismantle said voter suppressions in their respective states?
So, Alex, do you want to take a shot at it? I have a reaction too, but if you want to kick it off.
Sure. It's hard to say what the most common is. It really varies by place. Voter ID laws, which have now really institutionalized, are a big obstacle in many states. And then, there's kind of second order obstacles that then get built into that. So you have a voter ID law, which requires you to get a certain document, and then you close the offices where you might be able to get a hold of that document or make somebody travel 75 miles. I think there's a lot of variety. At the same time, not to be a little bit more hopeful, there's some real evidence suggesting that when the community mobilizes, and when folks like yourself mobilize, the fact is that the voter suppression laws end up in some places sort of increasing turnout, because people are so angry and become very motivated to vote by being told that we're not going to let you do it.
Is Greg back?
I think so. Mr. Moore, are you there?
Greg, are you back on? Did we get you? Well, let me just.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, good.
Yes.
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. My apologies, everyone. I hit the button the wrong way after I finished my comments. But could you just repeat that question? I heard the word voter suppression, but I didn't hear the rest of it.
Well, you're saying, well, what are the key tactics of voter suppression we need to watch out for if we want to stop it? Because the young people are very, very disturbed about voter suppression. What are the ones we need to watch out for in 2020?
Well, there's several things. The first thing I would be the attempts to reduce the number of polling locations. Now, we know they're doing that because of COVID-19, but when you have 1, 2, and 3 polling locations, which are reduced from, say, 300, as they did in Kentucky and they did in some of these places in counties in Georgia, you're going to have a long line. So you want to prevent that. If there's any legislation that's pending that says we're going to expand mail-in balloting so that the state can mail out ballots or mail out applications for absentee ballots, you want to support that effort. If you have an organization, you want to try and get as many people as you can to vote early if you have early voting. But the main thing is that we have to be vigilant about Election Day. It's going to be chaotic. We don't even have to guess. But we really have to make sure if we're going to be in line, let's start setting up those structures for people to make that a day of voting and spend all the time we can between now and then trying to put pressure on election administration officials to ensure that the voting is going to be safe and that the resources are going to be there to ensure that people can vote.
Yes, but let me just add to that. That's such an awesome statement, Greg. I want to just add to it, the practice of voter purges has been very diabolical. And we saw that in 2000, where Kathleen Harris, who was the Secretary of State of Florida in charge of superintending the election and doubled as the campaign chair for the George W. Bush for President campaign, she wrote a more than $1 million contract for a private consultant to purge people, dubious voters, from the rolls. And they were purging people whose names remotely resembled the names of former prisoners. I mean, it's the most outrageous thing. I've got some stuff in my book, Overruling Democracy, about it. And there are entire books that have been written about what they did. But, somebody would be registered as, Robert Johnson Jr., and then they would purge them from the rolls if their name was Bob L. Johnson. She'd say, yeah, cast a wide net. And of course, that was in African-American neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods, neighborhoods with high numbers of performing minority voters. So the voter purges, we've got to watch out for. We got to be fighting on. The other thing is all of those voter repression tactics and suppression and depression tactics that we haven't even seen yet, but that just come up along the way, because voter administration, election administration is actually extremely complex. And there are 1,000 decisions that are made all the time. I was watching the news the other night when they closed the polls in Kentucky at the awesomely early time of 6 p.m. I couldn't believe that the polls were closing at 6 p.m. But what working person can make it to the polls after work if they weren't able to get, the kids off to school, make breakfast, and get to work by 9, and they had to go after work, and they closed the polls at 6. But anyway, there was this huge line of people waiting outside of one of the few polling places they had left open in Lexington, Kentucky. And the rule is, certainly in Maryland and any other state I know, that if you're in line before the polls close, you're okay. Even if you're 6 blocks away at that point, they draw the line after the last person right when the clock hits 8 p.m. Well, it hit 6 p.m. and instead of going to the end of the line, which was a few blocks away, they just locked the doors and they said, if you're not in the building, you can't vote. Now, nobody had ever seen that one before. There wasn't anything particular that could have been done, but people started banging on the windows, and luckily there were voting rights lawyers on the spot who immediately began making calls and getting their injunctions ready to go in, but mobilizing the community, getting the media out. So, I guess the final answer is we don't know all of the mischief that they're up to right now. We didn't know everything that they were going to be doing with Putin in 2016 in terms of the cyber sabotage against the DNC and the DCCC and Hillary Clinton's office. We didn't know all that stuff. It came out later. So, but now people are alert, and we've got to be basically defending the barricades at every turn, every state, every polling place, all of the political institutions against all these forms of sabotage. Let's go to the next question. Thanks for that great one.
So Claire Fan is back.
Yeah.
to ask her question.
I'm Claire, and I'm a rising senior at Churchill High School. And I know that Asian American turnout rates are often very low. So I was just wondering what we're doing to address that and if the Asian American vote is becoming increasingly important.
Great. Greg, will you take that?
Yes, this is again an area of under participation over the years, and so people of color in general have been underrepresented in our electoral system. We know for a fact that the discrimination and some of the abuse against the Asian Pacific community, Asian American community, is growing because of this president, and so we don't want to do anything to create fear or create any hesitation on the part of our brothers and sisters to fully execute their right to vote. So we want to hopefully be a coalition of conscious people of color, progressive forces who are basically looking out for any problems that there might exist. I know there's a lot of organizations working on bilingual ballots because I know there are provisions in the Voting Rights Act from 1975 that allows for bilingual provisions to be given to communities that need the different language requirements for ballots. But we want to make sure there's that consideration being given by local boards of elections and secretaries of state. Let's keep the pressure on them, and let's make sure we do what we can to include everybody in this election.
Great. And let me just add to it, Claire, thank you so much for raising that essential point. The president has been making on an almost daily basis a series of racist remarks designed to gin up anti-Asian sentiment in America. Remember, he keeps talking about the Kung Fu. That's now his major go-to rhetorical device at these sick, disease-spreading rallies he's been conducting. We know that that is actually a point of danger for Asian Americans to be stoking that kind of racist sentiment in the country. And we want to make sure that it does not chill people's willingness to participate in voting. And that's another reason we need vote by mail, so people can vote from home in the event that they're afraid to go to the polls because the president has been stirring up all this anti-Asian American sentiment. So we will stay on this, and we're going to be working on it this summer, Claire, and thank you so much for participating. Let's go to the next one if we can.
Next up, we have Isabel to ask her question.
Hello, my name is Isabel Malizia. I am a rising sophomore at Hood College in Frederick, Maryland. It was very awesome to hear both Professor Keyssar and Mr. Moore and Senator Raskin speak on voter suppression issues. What I really wanted to bring up was the gubernatorial race between Stacey Abrams and Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. We were talking about voter purging and him being with him being the Secretary of State. I was reading statistics on this because when I was writing an essay last semester about how, as he's the Secretary of State, he had the power to grant voter IDs to prospective voters in the Atlanta area. And in October, there were over 50,000, I might be getting the number wrong, but there were a significant amount of voter IDs that still hadn't been granted in Brian Kemp's office. But Brian Kemp was also the person who ended up running and winning. So yes. And so my question was, why do you think he was not investigated for corruption or held accountable, especially when he was that Secretary of State that set that precedent?
Well, Isabel, what an awesome question. I'm going to kick it over to Greg Moore. But before I do, I've got to say this. America's elections are unique because we have thousands of electoral jurisdictions across the country. You know, if you go to Canada or you go to Mexico, there is a Mexican electoral commission. There's a Canadian electoral commission. They're made up not of partisans and elected officials, but they're made up of independent, nonpartisan people whose job it is just to administer the election fairly and neutrally without favor to any side. Then you come to America and you get situations just like that. It's a perfect example with Brian Kemp, who's supposed to be overseeing the election, making sure everybody gets the right to vote, but he's also running as governor. And there are all these people being purged. And that's what Stacey Abrams in this magnificent campaign she's organized is blowing the whistle about, that they purged tens of thousands or even more than 100,000 voters. And there was a record turnout, but lots of people got turned away from the polls. So You know, and why are we not getting prosecution by Bill Barr and Donald Trump? Well, one guess about that. I mean, it's a completely partisan railroad of the democracy. But Greg, you take it from there if you would.
Well, yes, and this sounds so much like what happened to us in Ohio in 2004. Secretary of State was Ken Blackwell. He was the co-chair of the Bush for President campaign committee. Not only was he the co-chair, but he took steps throughout the course of leading up to their campaign to make it harder to have votes counted. There were 215,000 uncounted votes on the morning that John Kerry conceded the race, which means all those provisional ballots were never, most of them were never counted. And we knew that 78% of those ballots were African Americans. What happened in Georgia was a repeat of that, except in this instance, there were voter registration advocacy groups that had done massive voter registration. They presented those applications at the end of the term, at the deadline, when a lot of us registered toward the end, but they never processed those all of those ballots in time to be put into the poll books. The poll books are the place where you store all the registered voters. So if your name doesn't show up in the poll book, you registered, but it hasn't been transferred over. It's one of those minute details, but that can lead to several hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of people having to vote provisional because they did everything right, but the administration of our elections was wrong. If I could say one more thing, Jamie, is that
Please.
The Election Assistance Commission was defunded by the Republican Congress for 4 years. They blocked funding. They stopped the commission from meeting. They wouldn't allow the advisory boards to meet. And it wasn't until 2014 that they even appointed the commissioners enough to get a quorum. That was on purpose because these election administration issues would have been fixed if you had a fully functional and fully funded Election Assistance Commission and the resources to move dollars to states to upgrade their systems. So this is by design, and we have to just keep being vigilant about this fight.
Terrific. And I don't know, Alex, if you wanted to say anything on this one too.
No, I think I'll pass on this one.
Okay, so Paul, I think what we got to do is go to our final question, and then we'll ask our panelists each to wrap up, and I'll have one thing to say to bid everybody adieu today. So, what do you got?
So, you had said you want to ask a question of both panelists about if there's any historical precedent for U.S. president working this openly and aggressively to suppress the vote.
You mean a president of the United States?
Yeah.
Okay, if both of you guys would take a shot at this, I mean, are we in a completely unique territory, or do we romanticize the past too much and it's actually been just as bad with other presidents? And use that as a way to, give us whatever concluding remarks you have. Let's go to Alex first, if we can.
I can't think of any. I certainly know of historical examples where suppressing the vote of the other party was part of the strategy. That's not new. A number of years ago, I had an assistant do some engrams of the phrase vote suppression or voter suppression, and there are two peaks in it. The phrase isn't used very often. There's a peak at the end of the 19th century, and a peak in the early 21st century. And what's interesting about both of those periods is that they're periods that follow in the wake of the acquisition of some political power by African Americans, and they're periods of high immigration where immigrants are starting to acquire political power. Mm-hmm. And so voter suppression, usually it is not, to focus more directly on your question, Jamie, it's usually not openly choreographed or cheered on by the candidate himself or by a sitting president. But certainly, there were prominent political actors. I mean, it's known, for example, that the man who later became Justice and Chief Justice Rehnquist was in Arizona involved in voter suppression efforts, decades before that. I think that I guess my concluding remarks here are that I don't come away from this history, even though I can easily point to precedents, and I can locate what's going on right now in terms of broad historical patterns. I have worries that go beyond that in this, in this election. I think what Jamie was saying before about we don't even know about the ways in which things might go wrong, and the fact that this election is in fact going to be administratively very complicated with a lot of, counting mail-in ballots, certifying mail-in ballots, counting, it's going to be very complicated. And what I guess in the end, the sober note that I would come to at the end is that I think that Mr. Trump and those around him have signaled an interest in having an outcome that they can say is not legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
And that concerns me a great deal. And I think that that's something that we all, in our own way, in whatever way we can, have to be alert to.
Yeah, that they would want to set the stage for some kind of revision or just divorce from the electoral process.
Right, or just to state, I alluded to this earlier, but to state this, for example, this is one nightmare among many for those of us who are in the voting business these days, but to create a situation where there are disputed or challenged outcome in a state or a couple of states which are close. It's taking weeks to count the ballots. And then the legislature of the state says, nope, actually, this has not been a good and clean election, so we're going to choose the electors by ourselves.
And if it's a Republican legislature in Wisconsin or Ohio or North Carolina, we know what they'll do.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alex. Greg, let's come to you for your closing thoughts on this.
Thank you, Jamie, again for inviting me to be a part of this, and thanks for all the questions that came up and for the other panelists and Professor, thank you for your comments as well. I believe that this election will be, unlike any other election in our history, one of the most contentious and contested elections. And so what we have to prepare for is the fact that we do have a president who is going to do, as the congressman said, try and discredit the results of this election, because I think he sees the way it's going. What we have to fight against is a few things. One, we have to fight against fear. Let's not be afraid to vote. Let's not be afraid to turn out. Let's not be afraid of how long it's going to take. Second, we have to be vigilant. And we know that the election may not be called on November 3rd. We may have to go 2 weeks, 3 weeks. In fact, in 2000, you will all remember, it was a while before the Electoral College met because there was a contested vote in Florida. So my guess is that we will have a president who will be reluctant, if not defiant, in this election results, no matter what they are. And so we have to make sure we're there, make sure provisional ballots are counted, make sure contested ballots are counted, make sure overseas ballots are counted, and make sure that we stay involved with the process and keep our eyes on the prize. As you can see from a professor's presentation, the right to vote is a long battle. It won't be won this year. It won't be won next year. It's going to keep being a battle. But if you could stay with this, and this Democracy Summer seminar, as I look at it, represents a lot of information that will help you throughout the process to gain a better understanding, to be great activists. So I'm very proud of my work that I've done over the years, but I just encourage all of you to continue your work and keep in the fight. I'll be there with you as long as I can. And sorry, my visual got lost there, but I hope I didn't lose my voice on this. Thank you.
Greg Moore, you have never lost your voice. You will never lose your voice. I know you've had some health struggles recently, and I want you to know we are 1,000% with you on anything that you need. And we are so grateful to you for the extraordinary work that you've done in the past and you're doing in 2020. Professor Keyssar, let's also add our voice in praise of your amazing work, your book, The Right to Vote, which is indispensable, which I recommend to all the Democracy Summer Fellows who want to read more deeply into the history of the struggles we're talking about. Thank you for being with us too. And I want to close with this thought. I went to a number of the protests, which I have found just utterly amazing and uplifting. And And I didn't see any violence except for the right-wing white supremacists that I've seen on TV trying to spark violence in different places. But at one point, we were chanting, "This is what democracy looks like." And somebody spotted me and said, "Wait a second, you're Congressman Raskin." I said, "Yeah." And then she said, "You're saying this is what democracy looks like. Why are you saying that?" I said, "Well, this is what democracy looks like." Democracy looks also like what goes on the floor of Congress. Sometimes it's nowhere near as pretty as what's going on in Democracy Summer, because that's what democracy looks like too. And this conversation to me is just the epitome of democracies, people making a passionate engagement with the process, with the issues of the time, with the values of the time, to make sure that everybody gets to participate. So I want to commend all of the Democracy Summer Fellows, all of our participants who've decided to drop in from outside. Again, Greg Moore, Professor Keyssar. I want to thank Paul Ellis, Maddie Krakoff, the whole Democracy Summer team for putting this together. Next week, we will be, I believe, July 3rd. We'll get you more details with Reverend William Barber. And the subject will be actually the theme of our Democracy Summer this summer, which is it time for a third and final reconstruction in America? Have all the elements come together with Black Lives Matter and the Young People's Revolution and Democracy Summer and the agitation for change? Are all the elements there for us actually to get back to powerful interracial progress on all of the critical issues of the time: public health and climate change and police brutality and violent racism and on and on and on. Are we ready to do it? That's what we'll be looking at next time. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week for the Democracy Summer Seminar Series. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks to Greg.
Thank you so much. Good luck, everybody.